You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I'm Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And oh my goodness, don't forget to like this episode. Just do it now because you know you're going to like it. Subscribe if you're on YouTube. You can leave comments. You can share these episodes with your friends. If you're on a streaming platform, you can leave a review. We appreciate all of your interactions. They really help us to grow our audience and to keep the podcast moving along, which is pretty great. And speaking of moving along, this is our 101st episode.
Yeah. Wow.
101st. Can you believe it?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's quite a milestone, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to keep going on about these milestones in the podcast. We've just had our 100th episode, and now it feels like almost the beginning of a new era. But these episodes are kind of special, aren't they? So, Todd, what have we got in store for 101?
Well, you know, we're near the end of the year. This episode is going to go up on December 30th, 2024. Obviously, we record ahead of time, but so around this time of year, you know, I got to thinking, people always are posting, you know, their top 10 stories of the year, top 10 videos of the year, top 10 discoveries if you're into science, that sort of thing. And I thought, well, we just finished 100 episodes. What if we did a top 10 episodes of Let's Talk Creation, right? Now, I figured this out mostly by just looking at YouTube views, which is not our whole audience, but it's a big, probably half of our audience is on YouTube. And yeah, we got a lot of new audience members who've joined us over the last year or so. Hundreds of people on YouTube, at least. And, you know, they might be wondering, you know, there's 100 episodes. Do I have to go listen to all of it? Can I pick out the best stuff or the top stuff? Well, here you go. Here's the top 10 hits of Let's Talk Creation. And yeah, since this is YouTube, I don't pretend like this is sort of some comprehensive sample, but it seemed like an easy way to figure out what people are watching and listening to.
Yeah, that's great. So we've picked out these top 10 episodes based on the YouTube views. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're our best episodes, because there is a kind of time bias here, because obviously the longer an episode has been up, the more views it attracts. Correct. So there is a kind of bias sort of inherent here. But nevertheless, I mean, these top 10 actually turned out to make for quite an interesting mix of topics and themes, I think, that sort of represent Let's Talk Creation. So hopefully it will be a really great introduction for those who are, especially those who are new to the podcast, to sort of dip into the back catalogue, which is pretty substantial now. So,
yeah, hours and hours of listening. Yeah. And and I think you're right. I think this is a really interesting cross section of ideas and themes that we have here on the show. And there were some recent episodes on the list, so it's not just always biased by time. Sometimes things break out and become really popular for whatever reason. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that this is not one of those awful clip shows. If you grew up in the 60s or 70s or 80s, you remember those nights where you'd turn on your favorite show only to find this weird plot happening where all the characters are gathering together. And then they start reminiscing, and then you get scenes from past episodes. Felt like watching a super rerun. We're not clipping together anything. I hated those shows. I always turned the TV off when that happened. And yeah, this is all new commentary. We don't do this very often. So don't be afraid that this is going to become a habit of us. We're not interested in always looking back on what we've accomplished, but it's a 101st episode. So let's see what people are interested in the top 10.
Yeah, you can indulge us. You can indulge us this once.
Yeah, so. Yeah. So, number 10. And we'll do this like David Letterman used to do. We'll start at the bottom of the list and move our way to the top. So, at the number 10 position, Coming in there, we have episode 36 from July 4th, 2022. And that episode was called Living Plesiosaurs and Other Arguments Creationists Shouldn't Use. So that was an episode where we just put together a bunch of arguments that we thought were sort of outdated, that creationists probably should avoid. This is a common thing on various big creation ministry websites. I think all of them have some kind of article or database of things that you should be aware of and not use because they're out of date. And I think it's a fair means of informing people and helping them understand when arguments need to be dropped. You should stop saying that because that's not correct. So in that episode, in the Living Plesiosaurs episode, we covered subjects like what it means to be just the theory. That's a phrase I don't like, but yeah, I hear it all the time. Microevolution, what that means, beneficial mutations, flightless beetles, and of course, the favorite phrase that I hear over and over again, if we all came from apes, why are there still apes? Oh boy. And of course, the headline star for that episode was the dead shark from New Zealand in 1977. And you might remember this, Paul. I tell a funny story about my own history with that carcass when I was still in high school. And so, it's funny. Kind of surprised that episode is still very popular. I don't know what it is that draws people to it. Maybe it's the thumbnail with the dead plesiosaur, and so we're getting crossover to other conspiracy-minded folk and cryptozoology people. Maybe it's our winning personalities. I don't know. Probably not, but we can dream, right? Maybe it's just the dead shark on the thumbnail again. But I haven't changed my position in case anyone's wondering. There's been no new developments that have made me reevaluate that dead body. It's still a shark.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely a shark. So that was interesting. I mean, over the years, there has been a surprising amount of kind of crossover of interest between creationism and cryptozoology, the study of hidden animals.
Yeah.
We should dedicate an episode or two to cryptozoology and creationism. Wouldn't that be fun? Who knows? We talked in the last episode about getting you over here to the UK, Todd. Maybe we should get you over to, and we should go visit Loch Ness or something like that. So that would be a fun episode.
I would absolutely go to Loch Ness. Yes.
Yeah.
I'll just say that publicly here and now. Send me to Loch Ness. I would love that. We could talk about the geology of Scotland. We could talk about plate tectonics, and we could throw in some Nessie lore as well.
Yeah. I'm sure. And you would have to return the favor at some point. I would have to come over to Lake Champlain or something like that.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So that would be great. Okay. Moving on. Coming in at number 9, I feel like I'm sort of announcing like the charts of the week, sort of the countdown to, so coming in at number 9 on our top 10 list is episode 34, Dominion, How Creationists Approach the Jurassic World. Now, at the time, this was our sort of idea to capitalize on the popularity of the latest Jurassic World movie. And I think it worked. I think that was a fun episode.
I mean, obviously it's in the top 10, so people must have liked it. It's super long. Jumbo size episode. We had 4 different guests? I can't even remember. It was a lot. It was a lot of people to try to manage the conversation with.
We had 3 guests, I think,
3
besides
guests.
ourselves.
Okay.
I think it was Marcus Ross and Matt McLean and David Lee and us too, I think.
Yeah.
And we threw popcorn at one another and that kind of thing. So,
I remember that. And I believe someone was wearing a dinosaur mask at some point. Yeah, that was a goofy episode. But these guys are all well-versed in dinosaur paleontology. So I think it was a really interesting dive into creationist perspectives on dinosaurs. As well as fun, reminiscing about the influence of Jurassic Park the original
Yep.
Crichton novel and the original Spielberg movie from way back when, and how that was so influential in a whole generation of paleontologists getting excited about dinosaurs. Now the movie, the movie that came out, the Jurassic World Dominion movie, that was, I don't know, less exciting. There was this whole plot with giant bugs in it, which I didn't really understand why I came to see dinosaurs, not giant bugs. But anyway, there it is. Yeah, but the episode was good. So go listen to Dominion, Jurassic World. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun with that. And just to sort of recap, the creationist view of dinosaurs, just for any new listeners. So we think that dinosaurs were created alongside the other land animals on the 6th day of creation. They were still alive, presumably at the time of the flood, and so they would have been taken on board the ark with Noah and his family and the other animals. And at some point after the flood, because of all of the catastrophic changes that had happened, the destruction of environments, lots of climatic changes and so on, at some point they died out, probably quite early on in the post-flood period. And the dinosaur fossils that we have today are a kind of snapshot of the dinosaurs that perished during the flood, that were sort of overwhelmed and were buried during the catastrophe of the flood. So we had a lot more to say about dinosaurs in the episode than just that kind of that brief recaps. But anyway, it's a great episode. Go and watch it if you haven't heard it already.
Yeah, I totally agree. I have a lot of fond memories of that episode, as complex as it was trying to manage all of it, and as long as it was. The science of the dinosaurs, dinosaurs themselves, the pop culture. Memories of things that influenced us as scientists. It was just a really great conversation. So if you're looking for a fun time listening to a couple of scientists rambling on about how exciting Jurassic Park and Jurassic World are, that's well worth checking out if you have that opportunity. All right, so what's next on our top 10 chart here, announcing the latest hit from Let's Talk Creation, number 8. We're going all the way back to the beginning of our podcast with episode 7, the Geologic Column for Beginners, part 2. Interesting. This episode was very early, I have to say. I sort of listened to some of this as I was getting ready for this episode, and I thought, wow, that sounds really bad. No wonder people were constantly writing in and telling us we need to get better production equipment. But listeners, beware. If you have not listened to some of the early episodes of Let's Talk Creation, you've only been enjoying the recent stuff with all of our fancy new technology, you might be shocked at how rough that sounds. But the content, I think, is still worth checking out. So the geologic column in creationism has been sort of a big subject for, goodness, at least 120 years. You might remember Paul creationist George McCready Price. Probably don't remember him personally, but you remember reading a lot about him.
That's right.
Yeah. He was active in the early 20th century, and he was sort of the one of the earliest sort of modern creationists. And his claim to fame, his focus was on the idea that the geologic column didn't really exist, that it was really just an arbitrary, you could go out and find any old rock piled on any other old rock. And so he accused geologists of essentially making it up because they believed in evolution. So it was a case of circular reasoning. But that is not right. So the column was recognized long before evolution came along, and long before Darwin published his ideas. And it can be empirically verified in a number of places. And Price's argument is persistent. Obviously, it shows up in the Genesis flood by Whitcomb and Morris. And we certainly still hear about that in the creationist culture. So those 2 episodes there on the geologic column for beginners, that was sort of our attempt to sort of try to set set the record straight, bring the argument up to date. It was, I guess, another one of those things creationists shouldn't use or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've covered a few of those, haven't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, we looked at some of the reasons why creationists are skeptical about the column, and a lot of it goes back to, Macready Price and some of the arguments that he sort of popularized. But we also talked about some creationist research on the geological column, which is still a very active sort of area of research and study. You will remember, Todd, just last July, it wasn't last July. What am I talking about?
That's right. Yeah, it's been a year and a half now.
A year and a half. Where has the time gone? In July 2023, we were at the International Conference on Creationism at Cedarville University. And you will remember Kurt Wise giving a very memorable talk.
Yeah.
A really remarkable talk about the fossil record, which was based on an analysis of a huge database of fossils known as the Paleobiology Database. And what was really interesting about this, looking at the kind of species succession in the fossil record, was how the flood kind of almost leapt out at you.
Yeah.
From this analysis.
Yeah.
From these results that he was presenting. And of course, that result depends on the orderly succession of fossils in the geological column.
Yeah.
The very thing which Price sort of denied, because he thought it was just an evolutionary construct. So, so Price didn't just make a mistake about the column. He actually, turns out he was criticizing something that turns out to be one of the most remarkable evidences of the flood.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Anyway, we will link to that ICC paper in the show notes. And I think I'm right in saying that Is Genesis History on their YouTube channel have put up a video of Kurt talking about his ICC research. So we will also link to that, because then you can hear it for yourself from Kurt Wise. So
yes.
Yeah, so that's great. Okay, back to our list. Let's see, where are we? Number 7. We're at number 7. The 7th most popular episode is from the 9th of May in 2022, and it was episode 32. What was the Tower of Babel, Part 1? Kind of sounds like Shakespeare, doesn't it? Henry V, Part 1 or something. Tower of Babel, Part 1.
Yeah, it's Shakespeare. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so recently I was asked to lead a service and to preach at our church, and I chose to preach about Genesis 11, verses 1 to 9, which is the story of the Tower of Babel. And it was really interesting because it actually attracted quite a lot of comment and questions afterwards. People wanted to sort of ask questions about, where did all the ethnic diversity come from? And, all these kinds of questions came up. One person said that they had never heard anybody preach about the Tower of Babel before. So, I guess it's not a very common theme.
No.
But this is a topic I know that you've given a great deal of thought to and have studied. And in this episode, I think we had a great conversation, giving a kind of framework for human history after the flood, introducing the Tower of Babel, talking about how it might fit into our understanding of the origin of different languages, different language families, ethnic diversity, and so on. So is that an area that you're still researching, still working on, Todd?
Yes, when I have the time. And that's always, the challenge, when you get the time. But and honestly, it doesn't surprise me that a person might never have heard a sermon on that passage. It's a strange passage. And trying to understand exactly what it means, I don't think that's quite as easy as some people think. But yeah, in terms of research, I've got a number of projects ongoing, as you might know, looking at the origin of humanity. And one of those projects that I come back to from time to time is trying to catalog archaeological sites in the ancient Near East. So I'm interested in something called the Paleolithic, right? You've heard of that. The Old Stone Age, where you have stone tools and how those stone tools relate to later archaeology like Jericho. And I think the ancient Near East is a great place to study that because it does actually then connect directly to biblical history in a way that a lot of human origins research might not. You're studying fossil Homo erectus in Ethiopia and Kenya. That's a lot harder to connect it directly to biblical history. But here, I think we have a really interesting opportunity to try to do that. So that's one of the many ongoing projects that I have cooking at Core Academy. Yeah. So
one of the plates that you're spinning.
Yeah. One of the many plates I'm spinning. Yeah. So interesting that ends up being one of those most popular episodes. I would not have thought that would be the case, but apparently I guess people are very interested in the origin of history of humankind. So yeah, that's kind of flattering that our audience kind of shares one of my all-time obsessions. Anyway, back to our list then. Coming in at number 6, most popular Let's Talk Creation episode. We have the only episode from 2023 to make the list, and it is episode 53. What in the world are Behemoth and Leviathan? So what in the world are Behemoth and Leviathan? I don't remember us taking a big, strong stand on that in the episode. Mostly I was interested in sort of understanding the history of how people have interpreted it, where our modern understandings might have come from. Yeah. So I don't remember us making a big fuss about what we thought those two things would be. And of course, we're talking about Job 40 and 41, the end of Yahweh's conversations or monologues there, his speeches. He refers to these two creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. Modern Bibles generally just tend to transliterate it as Behemoth and Leviathan rather than trying to figure out what they were. And of course, creationists have long believed that these are descriptions of recently living dinosaurs. But I'm really happy with what we did in that episode. I thought we did a pretty decent job at looking at the sort of the history of things and sort of trying to take this a bit deeper than just why you should think that they're dinosaurs, which is, that's your business. It's definitely worth checking out that episode.
Yeah. And I think it generated lots of comments and questions. Everybody's got a view about what Behemoth and Leviathan are. So I'm not surprised that episode has been so popular because people do, it is a topic that really interests people. Okay, we are at the halfway point. We're at number 5.
My goodness!
In our countdown, the anticipation of getting to number 1 is probably killing our listeners.
You can cut the tension with a knife, I'm sure.
So, number 5, we come to the first part of our geological column series. Which, we've already had part 2. But part 1 was episode 6, the Geologic column for beginners, part 1. Now, we've already talked about the first part, so we won't say, the second part, but so we won't say much about this here. But we basically sort of introduced the idea of the column, the concept of the column for our viewers in this episode, explained what it is. And we sort of told the story of how geologists came up with the column. How did they compile? How did they actually come up with this, construct the column? And I think that's actually a really interesting story.
Yeah.
So if our listeners want to, they're not familiar with that and they want to check that out, then go back and have a look at episode 6 because it is a really interesting story, and as you say, a lot of it is pre-Darwin. It was put together mostly before Darwin, because it was really just a case of observing patterns and geometry in the rocks, and order in the rocks, which you could do regardless of evolution, right? This is just observational science, and the interpretation kind of comes later. So interesting story. So go and check that one out. What's next?
And if I can interject here, I
of course.
believe that episode was where we talked about the law of superposition. Is that right? Law of superposition.
I think we did. Yeah.
Where the idea is if you have a series of layers, if you observe a series of layers of things that have been placed like a stack of pancakes, well, the one on the bottom had to go down first, and then the next one, and then the next one. You can't stack things out of order,
right?
Because that's crazy. And that turns out to be a really important thing in the study of archaeology as well. And it's something that I've become increasingly aware of as I've been looking at the context of a lot of the hominin fossils, trying to understand, is this post-flood? Is it flood deposit? What do these stone tools mean? You find them in geographically different locations, but do you find them in a sequence where you can say definitively that these tools came first and then these cultural indicators came later? That law of superposition is just stupendously important. So go listen to that episode, because I can see why it's popular, because it's a really important concept.
Yeah, and we talked about various principles, didn't we? Principle of superposition. We talked about the principle of cross-cutting relationships.
Ooh.
I think we talked probably about faulting and folding, and how that disturbs sedimentary layers. Lots of really important concepts.
Yep.
So do go and check that out if you want to know what those things mean.
Definitely check that out. Well worth it. And we're not going to describe any more of those things. So if you want to know, you have to go listen to that episode. See how we work here? We're boosting our own numbers. All right. So that brings us to number 4 on our most popular episode list. And that is back to the very beginning again, episode 8. Where is my missing link? And I think maybe this one's popular because we use that hot phrase, missing link. And so people keep wanting to argue about that. So, maybe that's why this one has become popular. And now in the episode, we ask and think about the issue of the questions about intermediate forms that evolutionary scientists use to argue are confirmations of evolution. So we take a look at Archaeopteryx, for example, and talk a bit about what a transitional form is, sort of as the missing link is kind of this word that's kind of already given away the farm, right? You've already given the idea that evolution is true and there's something missing from it. And so it's the missing link. And so we decided, some missing links or some intermediate forms are, maybe they are intermediate forms within a created kind, and others are evidence of kinds that are sort of between other sorts of created kinds. So Archaeopteryx, for example, that's not a evolutionary transition. It's not a missing link in that sense. But it is an intermediate form in that it has attributes of two different groups that are themselves multiple created kinds. Now, have we changed our mind on that position, Paul? Are we still sort of in that camp of these are different created kinds?
Yeah, I think that basically sums it up. And we talk in some detail about that in the episode. We think that God made all these different created kinds, and he used some kind of scheme, some kind of plan that reveals something to us about his own attributes, his own character, his own glory. And as creationists, I think we're still at the beginning of trying to understand what that pattern is and what it means. But But I think one of the things that we can say is that, it's actually rarely very much like a family tree, like an evolutionary tree, which is obviously what evolutionists tell us. There's something more going on.
Yeah, there's definitely more going on. So I was involved in some of that research way back in the dark ages in grad school, when I had a front row seat to the beginning of the genomics revolution, and it was fascinating to watch how what used to be a really nice, orderly evolutionary tree got all weird and scrambled up and tangled because of the genomic revolution in bacteria, in bacterial genomes, and archaeal genomes, if you know what those are. That sort of just utterly transformed our view of how organisms are supposed to be related by evolution. I felt like it kind of, I mean, you read Origin of Species, he's got one diagram in the whole book, and it's an evolutionary tree. It's a series of evolutionary trees, but it's basically trying to illustrate how creatures are related, how species are related.
Yeah.
And I felt like if we're going to undermine evolutionary trees themselves and suggest that there is no one evolutionary tree, you're kind of going back and making me think, well, maybe Darwin was wrong about his evolutionary ideas being the only way to explain those things. Maybe there are other ways. Maybe we should look into ways of examining how things are similar and different in ways that are not inherently evolution. And that was a big deal. I remember that being a giant deal at the time, and it led to a real revolution in the way we think about both genomes and genomic relationships and phylogeny and evolutionary trees and so forth. Maybe, Paul, we should do an episode on that, because that's a fascinating story.
I think we definitely should do an episode on that. In fact, phylogeny is really, really interesting. And this pattern of life, what this pattern of life is. And of course, it's not just, bacterial genomes and archaeal genomes where, people are now, instead of talking about trees, they're talking about networks and mosaics and reticulation and all these kinds of concepts. But we've also, throughout the whole of life, we've got ubiquitous convergence. I mean, convergence is just everywhere. What evolutionists might refer to as homoplasy. Which is where you have the same traits that appear to pop up independently, time and time again, multiple times. I was just reading an article the other day about how many times the crab-like body form is thought to have arisen independently and been lost, in lineages. So it's just, why do crabs keep evolving? Well, maybe there's something wrong with the evolutionary tree picture. So we should do an episode about that. Definitely. There is a whole story there, I think, that the public generally are not aware of. They see these very neat evolutionary trees, in the textbooks, in the magazines, and they think that is just settled science. They think it's just fact. And it's not. It's not settled. It's not fact. And we should definitely talk about that sometime. Yeah. Okay, well, we're getting towards the end here. We've come to our third most popular episode. We're into the top 3.
Ooh, exciting.
And these 3 most popular episodes, interestingly, come from 3 different years of production. So it's actually quite a nice sort of mix of production eras. The third most popular episode is one from the 18th of July in 2022. And it is episode 37. Why doesn't the Earth look young, and other arguments anti-creationists should not use? So this is, in effect, the follow-up to the previous episode that we talked about on arguments that creationists shouldn't use. I think that was number 10, wasn't it? That was the one we began with. This episode. It was number 10 on our countdown. Now, I remember, Todd, when we were planning to do these episodes about arguments we shouldn't use, you really didn't want to do an episode about refuting popular creationist arguments without kind of balancing it out with another episode that then looked at popular anti-creationist arguments we shouldn't use. So that was where the idea of having this sort of two-parter came from, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I have an equal disdain for outdated arguments, no matter where they come from and who they're directed at. Living plesiosaurs, creationists are species fixus. It's all bogus, and we need to jettison poor thinking and poor evidence and just sort of face some reality. So yeah, I remember very vividly. There's been several points along the production of Let's Talk Creation where I've felt very adamant that this is what we need to do. And I remember this was one of those times where I felt like, nope, we got to give it equal time. If we're going to criticize creationist arguments, we got to criticize the anti-creationist arguments as well. So now absolutely. In this episode, we go over questions like, are creationists real scientists? Do they publish in real journals? Most of these were not about data and science or maybe scriptural claims or anything like that. The sorts of things that we kind of covered when we covered arguments creationists shouldn't use. These were mostly just outrageous caricatures of creationists that were just never really true in the first place. Maybe, maybe back in the 1920s, during the Scopes trial, some of these might have been right, but it's been 100 years, people. Let's move on. There are plenty of creationists doing good research. I think one of the things that I'm most pleased with in terms of what we've done here on Let's Talk Creation is elevating a lot of the researchers' voices so that the public can get a sample of what's going on. We are scientists. We are scholars. We are doing research. We're actively exploring God's creation. We are not sitting outside of the halls of academia and science, throwing rocks at people. We're actually in there alongside of everyone else doing our work. We have a different perspective, obviously, but we are part of that community. And if you've never, been to the GSA conference here in the United States, Geological Society of America, you might not know about the regular presence of numerous creationists doing posters and presentations there, but that happens every year. So creationists are very involved. Creationists continue to publish their work in a variety of different journals. We're not talking about just creationist mouthpieces and blogs and whatever. We're talking about journals. You and I, well, most creationists I know, let's just put it that way. Most creation scientists and researchers that I know are published in some way in some conventional science journal. Sometimes those are inconsequential articles that don't have much to do with creation. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes we do things that are kind of directly related to our creationist research or have come out of work that was inspired by creationist thinking. So it's kind of just an ignorant slur to say that creationists aren't real scientists. They don't do real research. It's just silly. And it just shows that you're not really informed or aware of what's going on in the creationist world. And really, if you're going to tell me that, I'm going to write you off as somebody who has no idea what they're talking about, and you're not worth listening to. So there you go. Now you've been warned.
There you go. Yeah.
Like you care, of course, but you never know.
Yeah, I mean, quite frequently, I see new publications in mainstream journals by creationist friends, people I know. So, yeah, it's just not true. And of course, the same goes. You mentioned, the idea that creationists believe in species fixity. This comes up time and time again. It still is the kind of description of, this is what creationists believe. You see it in books and journal articles. as if we sort of believe that God made exactly the species that we see today,
Right.
and nothing has changed. And that has not been true for a very, very long time.
Yes.
Now, I remember actually recently you responded, shall we say, to a group of scholars who wrote a paper in which they kind of talked about creationists today believing in what they called hyper-evolution. This is a phrase that I've heard many times. They believe in kind of hyper-evolution, and that this is some new innovation that has just arisen in recent times. Just tell us a bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I know exactly what you're talking. So what you're talking about, there was in 2020 an article by 3 different guys: Joel Duff, whose name might be familiar to some of you listening, Thomas Beatman, and David McMillan. It was published in the journal Evolution, Education, and Outreach. And that was where they sort of presented this idea that creationists believe in rapid speciation and that this is a recent innovation. It's a very different thing than what creationists, even of the recent past, have believed, like Genesis, flood, Whitcomb and Morris generation. And I remember posting a piece on my blog. We'll link to that in the show notes, where I tried to correct the record that this wasn't a recent change, that this was in fact a quite old change, and there was a reason why this has become more widely embraced. And my point there was that, what the most significant contribution from the Genesis flood was that it sort of settled the question of how we ought to reconcile scripture and science, how we ought to go about reconciling Christian science. It sort of said, old earth creationism really isn't an option. Theistic evolution really isn't an option. Young age creationism, flood geology, that's the way we ought to go. And so there was a whole generation of us that grew up in the shadow of the Genesis flood. And I called them, native creationists. We grew up in a world where the smorgasbord of options was sort of taken away, and you were given basically one option. This is the right answer. And so that's why it became more popular. But this idea of speciation among creationism, that was very old. It goes back, as I've said before, well before Darwin came along. Now, one of the authors, David McMillan, I remember, he sort of, I don't know, he reacted to that and tried to rebut my claims. And so I responded. This is one of the few times where I've really gotten caught up in one of these sort of internet flame wars. I think it was nicer than a flame war, but it was still a tit for tat kind of thing. So anyway, I documented all the creationists of the past century who agree with my understanding of created kinds and speciation. And and then I went even beyond that. I mean, you can go, as I said, well before Darwin. This was stuff that people were talking about in the 18th century, in the 1700s, as people were first beginning to sort of study species and try to make lists of them. They already began to realize, wow, species are highly variable, or species are able to change. So this was well known long before Darwin came along. And the basic consensus was God's creation is not species. It must be some other category that has given rise to the modern species. In any event, we'll link to those articles in the show notes. We'll link to David McMillan's post, and we'll link to my response to that, so you can actually read it yourself and see whether I'm right or whether he's right. It's not my judgment call to make. I think obviously I'm right, but we always try to give you the option of looking at the situation for yourself and to making up your own mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another topic that we ought to come back to at some point, because the whole history of how people have thought about species would be a great episode. So,
yes.
We should definitely do that.
I definitely agree with that. That is a hugely interesting subject that I think most people don't really understand. I think the modern triumphalist history, where evolution is the dominant position, they have reinterpreted history as being everybody believes in species fixity until evolution solved the problem. And we now know that species aren't fixed. They're just, stages in the evolutionary journey. And that's just not correct. And of course, that leads to the false view that modern creationists are just holding on to that old view that species are fixed. That's literally not what we're holding on to. We haven't held on to that for a very long time. Anyway. Yeah. Anyway, I could go on and on about that, as you can tell. But let's get back to our list. Coming in at number 2, our second most popular episode. This is an episode from earlier this year, believe it or not, 2024. This one blew my mind. I'm looking at the name of this episode and I'm still confused by it. But anyway, this was episode 79, which was the launch of our series on Creationism 101, Creationism 101 in the beginning. And it is the only episode on this list from the last 18 months. And obviously we're seeing some chronological effect there because we've had a lot of popular episodes in the last 18 months. They just haven't been quite big enough to crack the top 10. So it's probably because the popular episodes from earlier years have had a longer time to be discovered and watched. But yeah, I remember putting that episode up. It seemed like such an innocuous, non-controversial Creationism 101. We envisioned that as a series of episodes where we sort of introduced people to what creationists think about Genesis 1 through 11. So we were just going to walk through Genesis 1 through 11 and just have an episode on various ideas that creationists have about each episode and about each passage and how we interpret things. It was intended to be something that was accessible to every part of our audience, every segment of the audience, so that you could sort of get up to speed at what we're talking about in the more techie episodes, right? The more technical stuff where we go off on created kinds and baraminology and the flood and catastrophic plate tectonics and whatnot. But that episode just exploded. It proved massively popular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was strange. And I think it had to do with the word creationism being in the title, probably.
Yeah.
And it was not long, I think, after we'd opened up the comments section on YouTube. And we just got loads and loads of comments, more than we'd ever had before. And we began to sort of scratch our heads and say, what's going on? It just sort of took off in a strange way. Now, you were pretty resistant to the idea of opening up the YouTube comments. I know, because, for all kinds of reasons, for the same reasons that you didn't have, and you still don't have comments on your blog.
Right.
And I think we even talked about that at the opening of episode 8, which we'd already talked about. So this Creationism 101 episode, it's sort of attracted lots of comments. 94 comments, I think it had to date, and that's a lot for us. I mean, I know some channels get much more than that, but that's a lot of comments for Let's Talk Creation.
Sure.
And a lot of them were kind of skeptics and critics that were just sort of quite angry and dismissive, and how stupid can you guys be, to sort of hold this young age creation position.
Yeah.
So it was very interesting. So we had a bit of a discussion. What do we do about YouTube comments? And how do we moderate all of that? You remember?
Yeah. And 94 is not all of them. There were some blasphemous comments that I deleted.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to come on there and say, I think you guys are stupid and I think you're delusional. But if you're going to, cuss at Jesus, you're going to get deleted, because I'm not going to let that happen on our platform. But anyway, I think you're probably right that the idea of creationism, and I remember our current producer used the word creation science in the thumbnail. And so that may have also been a trigger word. And I remember that most of it was just, it was, in my mind, such an easy little episode. I was just introducing this series, and I think based on the comments, people were expecting us to sort of give a defense of why anyone would be a creationist in the first place. And so they were very angry with us for not doing that, because that was never our intention. My favorite criticism, of course, of all books, media, whatever, is the person who comes in and says, I thought this was going to be something completely different. And so I'm mad at you for not doing what I thought you should do, which is weird.
Right.
And I get it if someone, is, false advertising and trying to lure you in with promise of something that it is not. But I didn't feel like we did that in that episode. But anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose to be fair, the series was Creationism 101, and it was definitely had a kind of biblical emphasis. And maybe creation science in the thumbnail just kind of gave some people a slightly wrong impression, but that was unintentional. It was just amazing how that exploded. I tend to just take a fairly relaxed approach to YouTube comments. I just think,
Sure.
Allow people to, post their comments. It's fine. If they use bad language or blasphemy, that's where I draw the line. But otherwise, if they just want to turn up and say, how dumb can you be? How stupid can you be as a creationist? Yeah, I can live with that. I'm thick-skinned enough to that not to worry me.
And really, people have no idea how dumb I can be. I mean, if you think I'm dumb in this podcast, you should see me in real life. It's much, much worse. Much worse.
Yeah.
Well.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, what are we on to next? Oh, okay.
Most popular.
Well,
this is number 1. We finally made it to the end of our list, Paul.
Yeah.
Here it is.
Before we come to number 1, though, I was just going to mention the second most popular episode from 2024, because that one you've just mentioned was the only episode that made the top 10, probably because of this time bias. But there was another quite popular episode, which was the episode on the local flood.
Yes.
Now, I don't. Yeah, so that kind of got to number 13, so it didn't quite make the top 10, but it was a popular episode, and I think it's because I'm not going to say it was a response to Gavin Ortland. Right. So Gavin Ortland is a very popular Christian apologist.
Yes.
This wasn't a kind of direct response to Gavin, but it was an episode that was sort of inspired, right. I suppose you would say, by some videos that Gavin had posted about, defending the local flood idea. And we sort of riffed off that to examine the whole idea of a local flood. So that was also a popular episode, but it just didn't quite make the top 10.
But that's still pretty good. Number 13. I mean, that's
pretty good.
Out of 100 episodes, to have 2 episodes in the last year show up in the top 13. That's impressive. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And of course, that does bring us to fanfare, our most popular episode. Our most popular episode so far. And it is another one from the beginning of our podcast, episode 10. And it was called Canopy Theory Considerations. Our guest was Dr. Steve Gollmer from Cedarville University. And of course, I suspect that this one became really popular because that buzz phrase, the canopy theory, that is still really, really popular in creationism today.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, thinking about growing up in the 80s here in the US, canopy theory was it. I mean, that was it. It solved all these problems. And the basic idea, if you've grown up more recently and you're not quite as steeped in this culture, the basic idea is when on the second day of creation, when God creates the firmament and divides the waters below from the waters above, idea is that the waters above were this essentially a layer of liquid water held aloft, essentially, above the atmosphere, that then became the source of the floodwater. That was one of the things it was supposed to do. I have a list here, so I'm going off my list here. So another thing, it was supposed to so that's how you get 40 days of rain, because there's this massive layer of water up there and it's draining out onto the earth. It's supposed to have produced a greenhouse effect in the pre-flood world to make the whole world tropical, essentially, which was a thing that people thought was true. It's supposed to have filtered out harmful radiation, so that there were less mutations in that time period before the flood. And the radiation and the increased pressure, atmospheric pressure from having a big giant layer of liquid water up there, that would have led to creatures growing to giant size and makes it possible for creatures to live much longer. And the reasoning that went into that was that, higher pressure means better oxygenation of your blood. And so that is somehow going to relate to wound healing and all sorts of things that would produce all of these effects. And there's a certain, Paul, we talk about consilience in philosophy, the idea of one idea that explains all sorts of disparate sort of data. And this seemed to be consilient, but it doesn't work. And I think the thing that we really came away with in that episode, it was that the amount of water that you can suspend at that altitude is just negligible. It really couldn't have done any of the things the people said it could do. It could not make things grow giant. It could not make things grow for a long lifespan. And it could not have carried enough water to produce the flood. It could not have carried enough water to rain for 40 days. It just doesn't work. And some other things there. The whole idea of there being a tropical climate globally from before the flood, I think that was mostly based on stuff that we would explain with tectonics today. That you have these sort of fossilized, lush climates that are buried in places that they were not growing. So you find, big, beautiful forests up past the Arctic Circle, not because it was tropical up there at one time, but because that's where they got washed and deposited during the flood. Anyway. So some of what the canopy was supposed to be explaining wasn't really anything to be explained. And some of it, and the model itself just didn't hold water, if you will.
To excuse the pun.
Pardon me.
Yeah. Yeah, and yet, we still hear about it a lot. So, this is, a lot of people who don't keep up to date with all the latest research, and, who can blame them? They've got lives to live, and they don't necessarily keep up to date like, we nerds do. But it's surprisingly persistent, like a lot of wrong ideas. It's been around for a very long time, not just decades, but probably centuries. This idea of a canopy, it goes back a long way anyway. But the research that shows that it doesn't work has also been around for quite some time now. I think there were papers being published probably in the 80s and 90s that were sort of beginning to be critical of the canopy idea. Mm-hmm. But these ideas, canopy theory, Paluxy River tracks, we did an episode about that too. Living plesiosaurs, they just have a life of their own, and they're just all over the internet, and corrections to those ideas are just much less exciting and don't get the same traction. And so, it's kind of, you feel like you're fighting a losing battle to try to sort of correct these ideas, but we do what we can. We try to sort of explain why, these arguments are not the best arguments to use. So anyway, so there we are. So I guess it's nice to see that episode being so popular, because it does sort of raise that the problems with the canopy theory for people who may not have heard that before. So
yeah, it's kind of nice. It's also kind of sad. I wish one of our most popular episodes was one where we got excited and talked about new creationist research and how exciting that new research is. But yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And you're right. It is persistently popular. It's one of those things that, if I go to a church, somebody's going to probably ask me about that. Have you heard about this idea? And, it's always uncomfortable because I sort of I feel like I need to just sort of let them down easy because I don't know their level of enthusiasm and, commitment to the model.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't want to freak them out. But it's also really frustrating because sometimes I'll explain, the physics and how you can't hold liquid water up there like that. And it wouldn't do what people have said it would do. And people would say, well, maybe God just held it up there with a miracle. And I think,
right.
No, you don't understand how this works. It's not a biblical teaching, right? What the firmament is, what the waters above are, it's not really spelled out in scripture. So it's not a requirement for us to believe this canopy theory. And it doesn't work with the physical calculations that you can just go through the calculations and work it out and realize you can't hold that much water up there. And it doesn't do the things that people said that it did. It wouldn't increase the pressure. It wouldn't filter mutations and increase lifespan and all the other sorts of stuff that they say that it's supposed to do. We don't have to appeal to some ad hoc miracle to save something that isn't worth saving. That's just how models are. Sometimes you realize, that model just doesn't work at all. And you just let it go. And you move on to the next better one. Yeah. And that's what we ought to be doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Well, that's the top 10.
Yeah. There we are,
10,
our top 10.
Number one most popular is the canopy theory. Goodness. It's a good mix of episodes. I think there's stuff that we really enjoyed, like doing, like Jurassic World episode, the episode on the Tower of Babel, things where we got to get really excited about research that's going on and things that we believe about creation. And then, of course, obviously, a lot of popularity with things that are mistaken that need to be corrected. Canopy theory, arguments you shouldn't use, and so forth. And all of them, I hope, represent that sort of careful, thoughtful, considered approach to these issues that you've come to associate with us and our channel and our show. We are not here, breathlessly telling you how much the other side is bogus, how much ours is proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt. We recognize there's a lot of hard questions in the world of creation evolution. And it's an absolute privilege, I think, for us to be able to explore God's creation and explore God's word and try to understand how they work together. So if you're new to the podcast, these are 10 episodes that are well worth listening to. And I hope this has been the best clip show you've ever heard because we didn't use any clips. I hope you've enjoyed it. Yeah. This is 101. Yeah. And now it inaugurates the next 100 episodes.
Yeah. And there's a huge back catalogue, and there are lots of things that didn't quite make the cut for the top 10. So go check out the back catalogue. There's lots to explore and lots of episodes that we've enjoyed which didn't make the top 10. So go and look at those. Todd, before we kind of sign off today, do you just want to tell our viewers and listeners about some of the financial needs that we have this holiday season?
Absolutely. It is the holiday season. Most nonprofits in the United States, at least, make a good 30 to 40% of their income for the entire year in the roughly month between Thanksgiving and New Year's. Our Core Academy of Science that sponsors and produces co-produces this podcast. We are no different in that regard. We are seeking this year a whopping $50,000. Donations have been down, unfortunately, as you know. And so we are seeking the Lord's blessing here as we wrap up 2024. We've mentioned this before. I'll mention it again. We invest a lot of time and effort in producing these episodes. Some of these episodes require a considerable amount of research and reading, which is a lot of our time invested into this. Paul, you know that as well as I do.
Yep.
Then we have all the time that we spend recording. So 26 episodes, that's 26 hours of work, just at the very least recording. It's usually a 3-hour session where we're talking about how we're going to do it before we get started. And then we record it. And then we talk about how it went and what's coming up next. So there's a lot of hours that we invest in this. And then, of course, all of the post-production that goes into it. So we have all the pre-production research and planning that goes into it. We have actual recording, which is really kind of short. And then we have, hours of post-production and promotion. Yeah. So it works out to about $17,000 to produce this podcast. And that's about $600 an episode in the year. And that is a lot of money. And it is entirely donor driven. We make a couple of bucks in ad revenue on YouTube from each episode. It is a pittance. It is almost an insult. But it's better than nothing, right? So I'm not going to take it as an insult. I'm going to take it as yet another avenue of blessing from the Lord. So this year, as I mentioned, Core Academy is seeking $50,000. So obviously, a bunch of that money is going to be invested into this podcast. If you've been blessed by this podcast, if you've enjoyed the work that we do, if you've come to one of our events like Creation Together, you might remember the last episode. Please do consider how you can be a part of what we're doing, how you can make a contribution to make sure that this podcast continues. And if you'd like to see us actually address a specific topic and you're willing to sponsor an episode, we will absolutely consider your ideas. As I said, it costs about $600 to do an episode. So if you want to make a $600 contribution and tell us, do viruses or do behemoth or whatever, we will absolutely consider your request and see what we can do. That is our financial need. How can people make contributions, Paul? What's the easiest way to do it?
Well, the easiest way is to go to our website, letstalkcreation.org, where you will find the options for giving. But you can also, if you're in the United States, for example, you can go to Core Academy of Science website. What's the web address? Todd, is it coresci.org?
Coresci.org/donate is the fastest way to get there. Yep.
There you go. And you can go and make a donation direct to Core Academy, but you can also do it through letstalkcreation.org. If you're in Britain or if you're in Europe and you want to give to Biblical Creation Trust, the other sort of co-sponsor of the podcast, you can go to biblicalcreationtrust.org and there is a giving page. You just click on the tab and it will take you to all of the options that will explain how to give.
Yep.
But we do really appreciate that. One other way that you can help us, of course, is to share the podcast with your friends. We love to see our audience grow, and obviously the ad revenue will grow as our audience grows. So, and as we get more views. So you can really help us that way by sort of telling your friends at church, and other people that you know, members of your family who you think might appreciate what we're doing, and encourage them to come along and subscribe and watch. So that would be great too. Okay. Thanks everybody for listening. This has been fun. I hope you've enjoyed it too. And we will be back in 2 weeks' time for our next episode. So we'll see you then.
Yep. See you then for episode 102. And we'll stop talking about which episode it is, I promise. See you later.
See you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.